Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Activist Lawyer. This is the first episode of 2023. We had a little break over Christmas. Hope you all had a really nice time and a really nice break. Hi Aoife.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Aoife joins us via Zoom. She's in Dublin at the moment and we're really happy to have Aoife as our first guest on this series. So just by way of introduction, Aoife Kelly Desmond is the Managing Solicitor at the Mercy Law Resource Centre in Dublin. Just a bit of background about the Mercy Law Resource Centre. Aoife will take us through it anyway. The Mercy Law Resource Centre is a non-profit interest law centre based in Dublin. They provide free legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness in relation to social housing and social welfare law. The specialist lawyers work directly with people in housing crisis to support them through legal barriers, preventing them from accessing safe and secure housing. They provide legal training and support to organisations working with their client base, such as homeless charities, domestic violence services, social workers and addiction services. They advocate for change in law, policies and attitudes which unduly impact their client group. Now, Aoife, who joins us today, has a previous experience in the corporate world where she advised financial institutions and public bodies on investigations, regulatory matters and complex litigation and disputes, which will, of course, stand her in good stead when it comes to navigating complex housing and social welfare law. Aoife leads Mercy Law Resource Centre's training and support programmes and as Managing Solicitor of MLRC is an active member of Home for Good, which is a coalition of organisations and individuals who believe that constitutional change is fundamental to tackling Ireland's homeless and housing crisis. We'll talk about that a little bit further. And back in July 2022, Aoife spoke on the right to housing, again something that we'll mention, at the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Among many other achievements, Aoife is also the chair of the Board of Directors of Plan International Ireland, an international charity that aims to advance children's rights and promote equality for girls. Aoife's experience of advocacy, frontline experience, passion for social equality and wide-ranging legal and regulatory knowledge will really strengthen the work of the MLRC. So we are absolutely delighted to have Aoife with us today.
Thanks, Sarah, for that very lovely introduction.
Well, look, I'm sure there's plenty more to that. And I mean, your work really is something that we'd love to talk about, especially, I guess, your journey into law before we get into the MLRC's work. And I'm sure, as I said, many people have heard about the work of the organisation. And I mean, what a time to be involved in the type of work that you're doing. I'm sure it must be very, very difficult. But really, we'll go back a little bit in time, Aoife, to your law journey, where it all started, and maybe that transition from the corporate world into where you are now.
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people who study law, when I went into it with really lofty ideas about being a human rights lawyer and changing the world. And then when I was coming to the end of my degree, I studied just straight law. When I was coming to the end of my degree, I was trying to figure out what on earth you actually do to become a lawyer. And really, at the time, I was looking around at the opportunities. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't really know a huge amount more than that. There just aren't a lot of direct pathways into human rights law, public interest law. And I think, I'm obviously a bit further into my career now, but I don't believe there's been a huge change in that. I think it's still the case that there's maybe a handful of sort of graduate entry type roles into that field. Most of the roles to train as a solicitor are in commercially focused law firms. And for me, the corporate world was just, to be honest, the most obvious and direct route. I didn't, have any huge knowledge of the legal world or connections in it. Yeah. And the corporate firms have graduate programs that you fill out for when you apply and you interview and you get a contract for 2.5 years, which was very appealing to me at 21 when I had no idea what the future was going to look like. So that's the very unromantic reason I ended up in corporate law initially. But I did actually like it a bit more than I thought, and you'd hope that would be the case since I did end up staying for 10 years after that.
10 years, wow. Yeah.
So I trained in a corporate firm doing public law litigation mainly and regulatory litigation, but mostly from the perspective of the public body or the organisation, so not from the individual side, from the other side, which was a really useful grounding and something I do still find very helpful now, because it is always good to know what the considerations on the other side of the house are. And that was, I suppose, where I started. I think, like a lot of people, I had a little bit of a existential crisis of, I might have enjoyed the day-to-day work, but I wasn't exactly happy with the lack of purpose in it. So I did try and kind of see if I could fill that gap with outside things. So I moved to another firm that did a lot of pro bono work. I did a lot of pro bono work. I think I was sort of at risk of not being allowed to do any more pro bono work. But it was really great to do that, and it kind of gives a bit of an insight. And I think it's great now that that's way more common. I think when I first started, it was pretty rare for firms to do substantial pro bono, whereas now it's quite widespread. And I think pretty much all of the major firms have a pro bono practice, and a lot of them now even have trainee rotations in pro bono, which is, I think, fantastic. But yeah, so I suppose then I also looked at trying to get involved in charities outside of work, and that's how I got involved with Plan Ireland. I joined the board there about 5 and a bit years ago now. Again, trying to look at, can I keep my day job that I do actually enjoy, but fill in the gap of the kind of existential crisis and other things. Yeah. And I did it for a few years, but eventually it started to feel pretty obvious that, you're spending, in corporate law, I was in financial regulatory investigations at that stage, and I was working, a really, really huge amount. It was a very, very busy team. When you're working those kind of crazy hours and it's taking up, 3/4 or more of your waking life, you start to say, well, that's, there has to be a point at which you maybe do what you actually care about for the majority of your time, not the other way around. So I was kind of looking for something for a while, and again, even at a more senior level, there's not a huge amount of opportunities that come up very often in this kind of in public interest law. And when I saw the role come up in Mercy Law, I just jumped at it straight away. And that was just coming up on 2 years now in Mercy. 2 years. And it hasn't been, it's been a difficult time. It's a challenging role. It's a challenging time to be working in homelessness. But I definitely haven't looked back at all.
This is a really poignant point to talk about, because it's what a lot of our listeners actually contact us about, confirming what you've just said, that there are very little opportunities. And even when they're in college, and the firms that come round to talk about working in law are usually corporate firms. And even recently I saw an advert for somebody visiting a talk in a local university about alternative careers in law. And there was nothing there that covered even public law, human rights law at all. So I think you're right that things haven't really changed, drastically from, 10, 15 years ago, especially, when I was trying to get into that area of law. So I think that's a great point. But then to transition from the corporate world and that very kind of, I suppose, heavy workload of financial regulatory affairs, was it a big transition to start working straight away in your current role, or were your skills, obviously your skills are transferable, that's a silly point, but how did that work, or how did you were there any challenges for you?
Yeah, I think it's something that, kind of looking back at it now, there was points when I was younger where I was really eager to move, and I looked at moving into, really wanting to get out of the corporate world. And I now actually, looking back, it was the right time for me to do it when I did. And I think I would have found it a lot more difficult early on. And I know it when people, people ask me about my career, and, people who come in working with us, like interns and things like that, it's not for everyone to work in corporate law at all, but I've never regretted training in corporate and working there, because it is really good training. You get excellent training, and there's also economic aspects to it. The charity sector is not the greatest, and it is good 100%. Maybe if you have student loans and things like that, to have a few years of a better salary before you kind of get set up. So, I think there's a lot of benefit in working in the corporate world. But for me, I had enough experience at that point of running kind of cases with the legal side of it. And I think what also really, really stood to me was the voluntary work on a charity board, because without that, I think I would have found the role a lot harder, because my own role in Mercy Law is the managing solicitor, is, it's the leadership role, it's the most senior role in the organisation. So I'm responsible for the governance, reporting to the board, all of our compliance, all of that. And I think I would have found that really overwhelming if I didn't have at least some idea of how it worked. And the legal work is transferable, there's an upskilling, and there's, getting used to dealing with a very different client profile. But again, having had some experience of dealing one-on-one with vulnerable clients through pro bono work helped,
Sure.
Which is why I always really say to people, if you think you want to do this, you need to start doing everything you can to get that experience, because I think if I did this when I was, 26 and had never done anything in that area and I jumped into a role like this, I think I would have found it, really, really difficult.
Absolutely. Well, look, we mentioned a little bit in the introduction there about Mercy Law Resource Centre. I'm familiar with the work. I worked locally just down in Smithfield in the Women's Council, and I know quite a few of the staff who've been there over the years, and the work is just amazing. And as you said, you've entered the organisation at a really, really challenging time. But can you just give us a little bit of an insight into the organisation and maybe, the Home for Good coalition as well?
Absolutely. So Mercy Law is, we've 6 permanent staff and a bunch of volunteers, which are just really fantastic and give us a lot of support. So there's 3 solicitors, including myself, and the other 2 solicitors are fully just doing the legal work and the policy work. So they're the real kind of part of the work that we do. Mercy was set up in 2009, and at the time it was set up because of the extent of the housing crisis and the fact that there was a gap in legal services for people facing homelessness. And at the time we were set up, I think there was a view that we may only be needed for a short period of time. And it's quite difficult now looking back that I think in 2009, it's hard to get exact figures from that time, but the number of people in homelessness in Ireland officially was, maybe 3,000 or so, whereas now the last figures from November, which is the most recent, it's 11,542. And, that's the highest we've ever had. It's even higher by over about 1,000 more than the last peak, which was just before the pandemic, because there was a drop off in the pandemic for various reasons. So it really has never been as bad as it is. And we don't have the next set of figures. We don't know what it's like in January yet officially, but I can't imagine it's any better, because I think the thing that's really just causing chaos at the moment, and we're seeing it in our own work as well, is that people are going into emergency homeless accommodation and they can't get back out because there's nowhere to go. So you're just backing up. So it is a really challenging time to be in Mercy, but it's also the kind of ultimate, the core of what we do. And our work really splits between social housing and homelessness work. And maybe during the pandemic, the majority of our work was around social housing. So that's maybe people who are having issues being approved for social housing, or, getting their medical needs recognised, or, all the sorts of issues people can have. But the homelessness side of things reduced quite a lot, because the government was, I suppose, providing homeless accommodation more easily. There was an eviction ban during COVID as well that kept the numbers down. But last year it just completely flipped. And I think, in the terms of the types of issues people are coming to us with, instead of it being as much issues of people who maybe are accommodated, but their accommodations are really unsuitable and they have issues like that, which are very serious, but they are ultimately, they have a level of security that they are somewhere at the moment and they have some safety. Now it's a huge shift towards people who are at that really basic level of having absolutely nowhere to go and being refused access to basic emergency homeless accommodation, which is, really the lowest standard. And I think last year, the proportion of our queries that dealt with that really basic refusal of accommodation went up about 200% on the previous year. And that's really concerning, because that's, that is just, it's really always the highest priority work for us.
And with that, obviously, you're providing one-to-one legal representation on very, what I'd imagine are quite complex issues as well. In terms of the advocacy then, and feeding into, the government and, perhaps, looking for a solution to the crisis itself, how involved is the organisation on that level?
Yeah, so we always try and make sure that we're bringing what we see in our casework forward on a more coherent policy level, because, for our individual solicitors working with individual clients, you want to get the best result for that client, but ultimately you're just sort of, putting a plaster over a wound if you're only helping the individual cases. So we've always had a policy focus, and certainly, we would do quite a bit of lobbying to government and, writing submissions to government, both ourselves and as part of kind of groups with other organisations. And we have been doing a lot of that, particularly around the shortage of homeless accommodation and those issues in the last few months. So on individual issues, we would lobby as well as try and progress things through individual cases. And then we also are kind of at a much more macro level involved with Home for Good, which is the campaign for a right to housing. So that's sort of taking it to the highest level of policy, really, of trying to change the constitution. But then we also be involved with, more basic lobbying for, changes to regulations and just changes in policy and practice as well.
And Aoife, would your clients be primarily Dublin based, or is it nationwide?
No, so initially we would have been a Dublin-based organisation, but homelessness was more of a Dublin problem. I know that might sound a bit ridiculous, but 10 years ago, the majority of homelessness, and I suppose numerically still is in Dublin, but it's become a much more widespread countrywide issue. So we as an organisation have spread out nationally. So we now take clients nationally, and again, the proportion of our cases coming from outside Dublin has gone up massively. I think again, the pandemic fed into that in a more positive sense, that because we moved to remote services, we were able to deal with people down the country, and we were able to say to people, no, you don't have to get 5 hours of buses up from West Cork to come up to Dublin to meet us. We can actually talk to you over the phone and just do it that way. So we've been able to expand our reach, but no, it absolutely is not just a Dublin issue. I mean, I would say I did a little piece of research last year on our numbers, and there isn't a county in Ireland that we haven't taken taken a client from. Although obviously it is the urban areas that have the volume.
Well, you spoke about numbers there, which are, truly devastating to hear. But just in terms of groups, are there any groups that are more, disproportionately affected by homelessness? Who are you seeing more, in terms of vulnerable people coming before the organisation?
Yeah, so I think that there's two strands to that. Definitely with how much the housing crisis has deteriorated, the profile of people entering homelessness has definitely widened, and we have a lot of people coming to us who it's the first time they're becoming homeless. They've never thought they would face this. You're talking about working families who have just had their housing situation deteriorate, and they're not what you would see as the typical profile of homelessness. So there is no one type of person who becomes homeless in Ireland today. But certainly in terms of that very destitution level homelessness, and where people are struggling to even access beds in hostels, it does definitely disproportionately affect minority groups. And I suppose the main minority groups that we would see being really affected are the Roma community and the traveller community, and then also migrants, and particularly maybe newly arrived migrants to Ireland. So people who maybe don't have very well established legal status yet, or who have their legal status but they haven't been here that long, and they can face all sorts of barriers being put up in front of them by public services when they're trying to get housing or even homeless accommodation. So that is something that a disproportionate number of our clients would come from minority groups versus the population, definitely.
And I wonder, I know the government recently has announced that a lot of the contracts with private accommodation providers for asylum seekers are now coming to an end. So surely that just adds to an already ongoing crisis, particularly with Ukraine refugees who arrived from early last year. Has there been any movement on that in terms of what they're going to do for accommodation and when that ends?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a word for it other than frightening, really. When I was listening to the radio yesterday evening, and they had various people on talking about this crisis and what they're planning to do on the refugee side. And I mean, they're saying they're doing everything they can, but they're also, the fact that the ministers come out publicly saying there are going to be asylum seekers homeless in the next couple of weeks is, I mean, that's not something they would have admitted. It used to happen every now and then, but they wouldn't, openly admit it's going to happen. And that in itself shows, I think, the scale of the crisis, and that it has a knock-on impact for everybody in the system. And definitely people who are in asylum seeking have so much vulnerability, and there's so many legal obligations that the government has around reception conditions, specifically for asylum seekers. But what we find concerning, and something that our work has to deal with quite a bit, is people, and sometimes it's people who've actually finished the asylum process and they have legal status to be here, and other times when people are still in the process, that there's a complete siloing of who is responsible for that. So you have, when you approach homeless services, the regular homeless services, and say, we have this person and they're homeless, and why are you not accommodating them? They clearly meet the legal definition of homeless. they just go, oh, asylum seeker, that's the responsibility of IPAS, it's nothing to do with us. And that's something that we've dealt with. You know, it comes up every now and then, but we're anticipating it exploding, to be honest.
That's been going on for years, and as we know, direct provision is still there, which is very concerning, given that a number of years ago, you know, there was a huge commitment for change around that. Another issue that we're seeing here is the lack of available housing for women who need refuge in domestic violence cases. I mean, that's presenting a huge crisis. What are you experiencing in terms of that? I know numbers went up after the pandemic because of people staying at home, etc., and various issues that feed into, you know, the reason behind domestic violence. Have you seen anything in terms of numbers around homelessness there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, you know, people who are coming from a domestic violence situation have always been part of our client work, but we've definitely seen quite a lot of issues with people who are maybe have gotten into a refuge, but then the refuges are only supposed to keep people for a certain amount of time, and they're so oversubscribed they need to move people on. And then we find people are getting to the end of that stay, and then they're engaging with the local authority, and the local authority is not dealing with them. So you have women who are, you know, obviously very vulnerable, and they're on their last day. The refuges literally cannot keep them because they've someone waiting outside who needs that space. And the local authority still has not made any arrangements for their accommodation. And we've had clients who are being told to go back to accommodation where the abuser lives down the street and has already broken into the property numerous times. And the local authority is saying, oh, we'll just go back there till we figure it out, when they literally can't. And there's Garda reports saying this person cannot go back to this property. And I think what I sometimes find frustrating with those kinds of cases is that when you intervene, it usually gets sorted out. And it might sound a bit counterintuitive, but I get most frustrated by the cases where a single email from us sorts it out, because to me that says you knew that this wasn't a legal or rational decision, and you knew that you hadn't a leg to stand on, but you just decided to refuse it anyway.
Absolutely.
You know, it's the thorny legal issues I can understand, but those ones really get my back up.
I mean, it's great that you're able to provide that backup, you know, in those individual cases, but also feed into the greater narrative, because this is such a crisis. And I mean, there's not a day goes by that you don't hear about it. But just in terms of the organisation and the work that you feed into, has there been any kind of standout moments for you since you've been there in your career that you're aware of with the organisation?
Yeah, so this isn't about a specific case, but just to kind of go back to the Home for Good and the Right to Housing campaign. So Mercy Law, as you know, being the only law centre that exclusively focuses on housing and homelessness, this has always been a huge issue of ours, and it's, I think, pretty much since the outset that Mercy Law have been campaigning for a right to housing to be recognised, and we were a founding member of Home for Good. But I think even when I joined Mercy Law, I think I would have been interviewing for Mercy Law around November 2020. I think I forgot my numbers right. And I remember talking to, you know, family members and friends, telling them I was going for this and saying, oh, they're doing this right to housing thing. And, you know, very, you know, educated, socially, politically aware friends of mine were going, well, that's never going to happen. Like, a right to housing, come on. Like, who thinks the Irish government would ever put that forward? And I was kind of going, yeah, probably, sounds nice, but is it likely? And when you look now, you know, we have a position where almost all the government parties have publicly supported a right to housing. They've committed to hold a referendum. Like, there's a road to be travelled in terms of what that amendment is and whether it, you know, how it goes. But the fact that that's now gone from a sort of a fringe hope to an absolutely something that is almost certainly going to happen, I don't think that can be underestimated. And I think a lot of the discourse around the right to housing at the moment is, you know, the odd op-ed popping up in different newspapers, and they tend to be taking the contrary view and saying, what's the point? Doesn't matter. Who cares? The real issue is there's not enough houses.
And I'm wondering, I don't know if there is, but is there a timeline on that, or is there when is that going to materialise?
Well, from what I've seen, my understanding is there should be something, at least some update on it happening this year, and I think the hope is very much that it will happen towards the end of this year.
Brilliant.
But I think that still does remain to be seen to an extent. I know that the Housing Commission that's been set up by government are working away on this, and we're all just waiting to see what they come out with. But certainly what's been said in publicly on it has been positive. But yeah, and I think it's, you know, sometimes it's hard to articulate, the importance of something that can seem kind of a bit esoteric, like a constitutional right, but it will be so seismic in terms of changing the way that we look at housing, and it not just being something that's looked at as an economic matter, but that it's actually looked at as a human rights matter, and that the state actually has a role in protecting the rights of its people and not just protecting economic interests, which is how it currently is set up.
100%, yeah.
And that, to me, if that can get over the line in the right way, I think that is going to be definitely the biggest achievement coming out of it. And we're not the only people involved in this, but we've very much been.
It's so necessary, isn't it? So that's exciting to see that move along, hopefully, and I hope you get support around that. I'm sure you will. The work that you deal with, I mean, whether it's representation, the one-to-one cases, research and complex issues, I mean, you yourself, you've heavy workload, I would say. How do you strike a balance between work and your day-to-day job, I guess, and your everyday life, or do you? have you found the secret yet?
No, I think it's definitely something I struggle with, because I've always worked hard, and I'm always happy working hard, but in this role, like I'm the person who's responsible for how much work I do, and I have to be the person responsible for not doing it. So, there's nobody coming over my shoulder saying, okay, you need to go home now, take a break. Yeah. So I have to manage that myself. And I do think people who probably go into law generally, and people who work in commercial law, definitely have a tendency, if things are going out of control, to go, okay, the answer is I'm just going to work constantly until this is fixed. And I've had to definitely unlearn that, in the sense of, unfortunately, there's always things happening that are really urgent and seem really important, and can seem like a crisis, I guess. But you can't just be in crisis mode all the time. And it's taken me quite a while to kind of accept that I can't be in firefighting mode constantly, and that we do have to learn how to prioritize what is truly urgent, and where something is very important, but perhaps it can wait, to maybe find ways to explain that to people, and to do what you can to support them, but to accept it's not doing the best for the organisation or the client. If the solicitor is falling over because they've been working till 12 o'clock every night. So we try very hard to have a good work-life balance in Mercy, and I think we do it mostly pretty well. I think I'm the person who's probably guiltiest of not always doing it, but
it's so important. And I think all of our guests, because they work with, whether it's working with, vulnerable clients, and most of them are, and, also hearing traumatizing stories a lot as well, they really take that work on. And it's a question we're just, I suppose, in modern day life as well, it's important. I think your point is very valid, that if you don't, have that element of, looking after yourself and minding yourself, I guess, it will affect your work more than you think. So that's really great advice. And just on advice, you've a really interesting journey there from the corporate world into where you are now. What advice would you have for anybody who is perhaps, I suppose, working in corporate law in a more commercial setting, and would think, well, look, I'd like to go into human rights? You touched on it a little bit, but just what specific advice would you have for anybody who wanted to follow your footsteps, Aoife?
So I guess the main thing I would say, and this is kind of advice I give anyone who's struggling with their career, but particularly if you're trying to look at moving into a different area, is just do as much as you can that opens opportunities. And you do different things that you mightn't really be able to see what at the end of it is this going to get me. But if an opportunity presents itself where you find an opportunity that is adjacent or in the area you're interested in, just go for it. When I joined the board of Plan, I had no idea where it was going to go. You know what I mean? I just knew, I really want to work in charity someday. I'm now at a level of my career, I'm appealing as a board member to a charity, so I'm just going to go for it and see what happens. And, if you told me then that I'd be, the chairperson 5 years later, I would have probably said you were mad. And that, the amount, I can't emphasize enough how much that role has benefited me in a role now where I report directly to the board and I'm responsible for charitable governance. I didn't need to do a diploma in charities governance because I have had 5 years experience of actually doing it on the ground, as well as a legal experience. So I think it's just getting involved in things that are interesting, and if you see things coming up, just go for them. There's so much voluntary work available in the charity and non-profit sector because of the financial constraints that we all have with our budgets. So like, just put yourself forward for things, you know. And definitely, if you're a corporate solicitor, I mean, if your firm doesn't do pro bono work, there's things you can do yourself, like volunteering for FLAC or different organisations. But also, if you're in a big firm, they should be doing pro bono work. And if they're still not today,
get
you
on
should be
to
advocating for them to do it.
I think that's brilliant. And we definitely see the benefits of pro bono work, especially within, I know there's call out now for people to get involved in immigration specifically, but it was wonderful to see the amount of lawyers get together around Ukraine. And although, I mean, to find an immigration lawyer is incredibly difficult now in Northern Ireland, there's a massive crisis here. And I know in other parts of the UK that they really need to rely on people with a legal background in general to help pull those cases through. But I think that should be played out across the board. And it obviously worked as a model. So the importance was really seen there. But just, I suppose, a question that we ask all of our guests, but I think this is really, really relevant to you and to your organisation because you see it in action, is about the relationship between activism and the law. And your organisation, just on what you've said, really encompasses the two. But how important is it, do you think, that, you know, those two things, two elements work alongside each other to make change? Or do they? Are they effective in terms of making change in society?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do believe in the power of activism, and I believe in the power of the law to make change, 100%. And I think, you know, for us, we obviously very much focus on the legal side, and it's, you know, we can do so much with the legal side, but then we very much need other organisations and other individuals who are maybe not constrained by the legal framework to do that activism. And I think those things have to go hand in hand. And, you know, I think for a lot of people who come to us, you know, they might come to us with a particular issue, but it's rarely the first issue that they've had with a public service. They might have been struggling with trying to get supports and trying to get help for years and being really like mistreated a lot of the time and given a complete lack of respect and really kind of diminished in their dealings with public services, trying to access housing and trying to access supports. And like, I cannot overestimate the power that it has for people when you can say to them, it's not just that you've been treated unfairly, but you have, and it's actually unlawful. And here's what we're going to actually do for you because what has been done to you is not correct. And like that has such a power for people when they realize there is something in our system that is actually on their side and that they are in the right. I think that it means an awful lot to people to know that. And it also, you know, in some ways, it's the most powerful thing you can do if someone's really entrenched in a really difficult situation. If you can get the law to say, actually, this person has to be given this and you have to do this and it's unlawful, and you can get that result, you know, on an individual level, that's as powerful as it can be. I know that the law is very important for change generally, and like strategic litigation and cases can be really important, but on an individual level, the law is the most powerful thing, I think, as far as I'm concerned, for individual cases that get stuck in those issues. And then the activism has to come together with the law for making kind of broader change. It's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah. Both together. Well, look, I mean, the work that the Mercy Law Resource Centre does is vital and necessary. I'm just overwhelmed by, you know, just guests like yourself that come on and demonstrate the fundamental work that they're doing to make change, and especially with your organisation working through such a crisis at the moment. I really wish you and the organisation all the best, and we really look forward here at Activist Lawyer to following, you know, the year ahead and any changes that occur around your work, and we'd love to have you back on at some point, Aoife, to discuss all of that. But thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fantastic to have you here.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining us again. We really appreciate your support. We would also say, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love if you could share it, like it, and maybe give us a review. We're really hoping to get our listenership up and really expand for 2023. Please also have a look at our website, activistlawyer.com, where you will be able to find all sorts of lovely Activist Lawyer merchandise. So check that out and look forward to chatting soon. Bye.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.